Representative Graves, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be able to join you. I look forward to the conversation.
Why don't we start, a little bit with your background, where you're coming from, and then maybe about the district that you represented and what was unique about it and how it changed over time.
Sure. So I'm from Northwest Georgia. Grew up there, grew up in the mountains. Didn't grow up in wealth, didn't grow up in politics. Really grew up very simple, humble beginnings in a single wide trailer. Had a mom and dad that loved me and encouraged me and wanted me to accomplish much more than they ever had. And, my dad actually that sort of had a theme that, my dad helped me with over time. He inspired me by saying, dream big, work hard, and achieve much. So I really tried to take my, my street smarts or whatever, and survival skills and such like that, through life. So I ended up going to graduate from the University of Georgia and moving on in small business and starting a family, but never ever thought I would be involved in politics. That was the least of interest for me. I mean, I was active, like most people, vote and engaged and watched the news here and there and stuff, but never really thought I'd run for office. And, I guess my early reflections of politics in the house with my parents was I knew an election was coming when they were arguing about who they were going to vote for, because they never voted for the same person, it seemed like. And they weren't party affiliated. They just were personality and preference affiliated, I guess, with whoever might be running at the time. But I decided to run for state representative. Again, it's just over 20 years ago. And first office I ever ran for, a Republican, had never been elected in that district. And I was not from that community. It's a little bit further from where I grew up. And I was always told, hey, there's no way you can win. You're not from here. You're a Republican. And oh, by the way, you're not from here. And but we just as any candidate does, they have their message, they have what drives them, and we worked hard to communicate that. And I happened to be the first Republican elected there since, I guess Reconstruction was sort of the message then. But that was just in State House. And so I served 8 years there, and I was in I'm not a lifer kind of guy. You'll get some of that through our conversation. I believe you serve for a period of time. You sort of know when that season's up, and it's up to each and every individual. I don't think you put time limits on it, term limits, things like that. You just sort of know, as you do with maybe even your own other careers or other things you're doing. And so I was not going to run for re-election in my fourth term, after my fourth term. And it just so happened a district opened up. Nathan Deal, who was a sitting congressman at the time, decided to run for governor. And, that I did a little reflecting there and chose to run on the next level. And that was for the U.S. Congress. So you're asking about the district. It's a very wonderful district. My first district was across the top of the state of Georgia, very mountainous, beautiful, wonderful people, salt of the earth folks, that most of whom grew up much like I did, grew up and not the best of circumstances, and had generations of families that had grown up that way. And then shortly thereafter, the district was changed because of redistricting, and about 55% of my district was new within a year of serving. And so then I had the chance to go and meet a bunch more new people, and get to know them and learn what was important to them. So it was, so the district was just, the latest district I represented was a corner of North Georgia, northwest corner, and it'd be Dalton and Rome and sort of the textile area, known as the carpet capital of the world. My first district was the poultry capital of the world, and then moved to the carpet capital of the world, where I represented. But great folks. It's probably, it's a very spirited district, as you can imagine, very independent voices. Votes heavily Republican, but doesn't mean it's party affiliated or aligned or groupthink that way. It is a very independent, thoughtful group of folks I represented that gave me the space. And this is what's really unique, is they gave me the space to be independent as well, to be an independent voice. And, oftentimes I was voting with my party. Oftentimes I was challenging my party. And the district, and that did reflect the spirit of the district for the most part. And because one thing you learn when you're a representative, and I should say this is one of the most conservative districts in the country based on, the stats they put out there. Uh, but it didn't mean I had to have that kind of tone all of the time. Maybe that's the philosophy or the ideology of the district. But I was real careful about tone too, because I thought it was really important that you have the right tone. Is if you're going to influence outcomes, is which what the goal should be. You're trying to persuade others to support your position on something. It's probably best you don't poke them in the eye and kick them in the teeth every day. And so I really tried to have a tone that reflected the district, but also the values of the district as well. So we had to touch a little bit about the place I represented, and then after nearly 11 years of representing those folks, which honor my life, I decided, it's time to pass the baton on. I don't know to who. I had not picked anyone, had no one in mind. I feel like the district, in my opinion, had made a good decision in their representation for the decade prior. I feel like they could do it again, and so and that's where I think politics is unique today. You have those that want to stay for 20, 30, 40 years, and maybe they do a great job. And then you have folks that are the younger families that come in that serve less time. They serve the 6, the 8, the 10 years. And I think that's good. I think it's healthy. I think it keeps the system, it keeps, in my case, I wanted my son, he was a track runner. He ran the 4x4 relay. And there's something about that mile, it's the fastest mile that's going to get run that day. And it's because they're handing it off to fresh feet every lap. And so I feel like that's good for representation of the district too. It's important to hand, and in my case, I want to hand it off in stride and not be all bogged down and weary, and hand it off to somebody that was ready to pick up that and even take it a little bit faster and at a better stride. So a little bit about the district there. Great folks.
And so let's talk then about, when you're in Congress, and, as a representative, one of the key duties, I guess, is to introduce bills, right? That's the prerogative of the member, right? And that's the only way bills can get created is by members to create them. When you were there, what made you decide which bills to sort of create? Was it coming from the district? Was it coming from national? Was it your personal values? What are the influences and what are the different what are the different ways in which you came to the bills that you ultimately reported to the body?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it changes over time. I think you go through phases. When you're first elected, you probably campaigned on things you were going to do. And so you have that obligation to follow through on that. There's just an issue that's important to your district, or it's just important from a value set perspective. And you say, if you elect me, I will do X. And so I think your first phase of being elected, that's largely what happens. And that's important to follow through on those commitments. And then afterwards, what I found was best for me, I was assigned to the appropriations committee. It's the only standing committee I served on. And so generally a member will work within their committee. So the subject matter of that committee, once you get outside of the things you might have campaigned on. And so for me, they were more budget oriented because I was seeing a process and I was seeing ways in which that process maybe could be fixed or it could run a little better, smoother, modern, bring things forward a little bit. And so, that's where I spent a little focus there. I mean, there was the cut, cap, and balance concept. There was the, David Perdue from the Senate and I introduced a budget resolution to really change how, the process of budgeting, because it was coming from two different business people thinking through how do you do that, but because we both had that kind of desire. But then I think you move into another phase, which I did, and that is you find your subject matter. You should be at some point subject matter expert. And some members, they seem to be experts on everything. I don't know that that's possible. That the government's too big, too broad, and the issues are too vast. And so for me, I settled into cybersecurity. And because it just, I was seeing it through my appropriations work when I chaired the Financial Services Committee. I've seen the impact on the financial service sector and other sectors beyond that. And so I just chose to take that topic and to look at what is current law and how can that law be fixed to try and to prevent more cyber crime, to bring more people to justice through that kind of crime or activity that was occurring, because it was just largely not being touched. It was a lot of legislation to say review or consult or share information rather than really fix the problem. So I would say you go through those phases of what you campaigned on, your committee work, and then at some point you become a subject matter expert. That you really want to be that, because you want people to turn to you when something's happening in the news and it comes through every month, 2, 3, whatever it might be, that they're turning to you because you are the expert in that area.
And so did the ideas for the specific legislation, are they coming from your work? Are they coming from, think tanks? Are they coming from the committee staff? Are they coming from your reading and watching the media? Or is it all those different things? Or are there some kind of sources that are more important than others, or that you found that were very useful in thinking through, like, not only what you should put forth, but like, what else did other people put forth? You don't want to put forth exactly the same thing. So I'm sure there's some kind of like, assessment of where the gaps are.
Yeah, so they come from all over, and you have to keep an open mind to that. I think think tanks provide, they're such a great resource for members of Congress, because the resources they have and the experts they have, and they can drill down into topics so much better than we can, because while we have great staff, we have limitations in the House. The Senate has much bigger staff and capability than House members. So think tanks are great, but they come from constituents too. I'll never forget one of the biggest changes I made in Georgia dealt with, it helped the state through a tough time dealing with the calendar, the school calendar. And so different counties, and this is going to sound so crazy, but in Georgia, it was required to go 180 days. Every school system had to have a 180-day calendar for their students. But yet during this period of time, the communities were struggling with their budgets and the cost and the food, everything. There was something going on. I think it was the 08-09, it's just prior to that. And so ad valorem taxes were down. Everything was changing for the communities, and they just didn't have the resources. And I'll never forget a superintendent coming up to me and go, we really don't need to be there 180 days. We just need to be there a certain number of hours. Is it just possible that we stay an extra hour a day in our system and we knock off a week, 2 weeks off the calendar? We're already there. The kids are already there. Let's just add an hour. I'll never forget that. So I literally changed like 13 words in Georgia law that just said, it was 180 days or the equivalent of. It was really basically all I changed. And one of my school systems that ended up being in my congressional district took an entire month off their school calendar just by adding time to current school days, which saved them so much. So you get ideas like that just from a constituent who observes something and says, why do we do things this way? It'd be make sense if we just did it this way, So that's another area. And then some of it's just what you think of, right? Your own creativity. You go, why does the law just the same way? Why are we doing things this way? Cyber, for instance, has not been updated since the 1980s. 1987 was the last update to the cyber law, and it's still not been updated. And there's a reason for that. And you should ask that question. What's that reason?
What's the reason?
There's not an understanding, right? There's just, it's a new emerging issue. The average age of the members of the House of Representatives 2 Congresses ago was the highest average age of any Congress in the history of our country. And so you have a lot of members. I just happen to be on the right, so just on the bubble of where there's an understanding. You grew up with a computer somehow in your home, and so the Senate even has a higher age average as well. So some of it's just people they haven't adapted to the newness of something that's occurred. And that is truly the case in cyber. Cybersecurity, cyber threats, the cloud, all these kind of things are very new to a lot of people that have been there for decades and decades. And so it's just a big change. Yeah. So it takes time.
You think that's a function of the age of the members, or their, I should say, related to their experience, rather than, that the fact that it's not concentrated to a particular committee or a power structure.
Yeah, it is clearly, and there's multiple issues like that, but it's one of those issues that's just going to take time. The body has to evolve to the understanding and adapt to it, basically. And so when you have an average age in upper 50s to lower 60s, they didn't grow up with a modern day computer in their home or understand, so they're coming in from on a different learning level, different plane, basically. And it's funny. So my wife is a few years older than me. I grew up, with a different understanding of technology than she did. She's always asking me, hey, can you show me how to do this? I'm just not good at this stuff. And that's where I see that's just a common thing. It's like a generational divide with technology, basically.
So let's move on then from your own bills to other members' bills that you would either co-sponsor or ultimately vote for.
Mm-hmm.
What are the confluence of factors that really play into a member's mind? I mean, obviously there's party, there's in theory, there's the district interest, there's the values that are inherent, in your own upbringing. What are the real things that, and there's relationships, I guess. So talk about, why would you co-sponsor a bill, and why would you ultimately vote for or against a bill?
Yeah, I mean, you hit on all the points really that would touch on it. And that's, some of it's about relationships. Some of it's just a belief in the idea of the concept. Some of it's just helping somebody build support. And that's a large part of how a bill gets passed, that it has broad-based support. I mean, it's important you believe in it, what it is. Some things are, you've supported in the past and somebody's tweaked it, modified it. And so they say, hey, we saw you did this, we're doing something similar. So you do that as well. Some of it's to send a message back to your district of where you stand on an issue that you align yourself so much for, you're willing to put your name on it from a legislative perspective. And then sometimes it's important you don't co-sponsor things. Maybe it by not being a part of something, it gives you an ability to step back and view it from a more unbiased perspective, to provide a little bit more ideas into the concept before you do support it. A lot of it's about relationships too. It's one thing that's not really known broadly is that a lot of the relationships, while it's member to member, are really important. Staff to staff relationships are really important too. So, my staff, I want to make sure that they had a good relationship with other offices. And so if somebody was always calling and saying, hey, will your boss do this? And I was always saying, no, 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 no. It really hurt their ability to work with another office when I needed help on something, So there's a little bit of a balance of all those things there.
When you co-sponsor a bill, is it typically you would vote for the bill, or is it a different concept?
Yeah, if you there's a handful of times that a bill will be co-sponsored, and the bill will change. All right, and sometimes it changes in its entirety. Everything is stripped out of it, and something else is put in it completely. And you find yourself in a really awkward spot of you have co-sponsored something that is just that's something you totally don't believe in, you're not for. And so you have to vote against it. You have to actually try to remove your name from it. And that's a difficult process in the House, but it's doable. But you find yourself voting against something you actually co-sponsored, only because it changed, in substance form.
But that's a more rare situation. Typically, if you co-sponsor something, if it didn't change, you would ultimately vote for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would. And yeah, I didn't want to co-sponsor anything I wasn't willing to support. Yeah.
Right. And what about when
disingenuous? One thing about being, in these positions, while you see a lot of negativity and people are, not always kind to one another socially on social media and publicly, sometimes on TV, your word's really important. So when you say yes to something, even if it's a handshake, even if it's just verbal yes, it's important to stick with that. And so co-sponsorship's the same.
what about when there's different bills that are trying to achieve the same objective, right? And maybe you think one bill is better than another. I don't know if the situation actually comes up or not, but is that in such a situation, what's the calculation in the mind of the member? Do you support all the bills that kind of try to solve the problem, or do you choose the one that you think is best? How does that play out? Or do you choose the one that's most likely to ultimately pass the body, regardless of its merits, compared to the other options? How does that play out?
Yeah, you could do any and all of those. And that was the case. There's a balanced budget amendment. There's a approach where there's like 3 or 4 different concepts out there. And each one, maybe call it like different flavors, as there are different colors on the color wheel, basically. And everybody sort of finds their own comfort level of what does that mean. And for me, I would co-sponsor maybe 2 or 3 of the concepts, but maybe not all 4 or 5. And one delineation I recall happened to be that the balanced budget amendment that was offered would allow for the increasing of taxes to balance the budget. And I don't know, that's just something I wasn't comfortable with. So I just, I didn't want that in the Constitution, as an amendment, so there's maybe little things like that you look at and you go, okay, if one were to happen, which one would I really pursue the most?
So in that case, it was on the individual merits of the bills rather than which one had the most likelihood of passing the chamber. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
You weren't trying to sort of game the ultimate result. You were looking at the data in front of you and choosing the best among those options.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's, all of that's tough to do, right? Everybody wants to be on the winning side of something. And I think as an elected official, you need to be consistent in where you are as best as you can. I mean, every now and then you're going to deviate and just to offer support to help somebody out that just needs a new member, a freshman member who's just, they've got that first bill that they're working on that they said if they were elected, they would do. And you're like, hey, yeah, I'm happy to help you out, because they're developing friendships and relationships, getting to know each other. And that's part of their exercise of doing that, is locating you on the House floor while you're voting and saying, hey, and it's funny, they may even have a picture their staff gave them, say, look up this guy here. He's supported this kind of stuff, fiscal responsibility things in the past. Go talk to him about it, and then, so sometimes you're assisting somebody in that way as well.
Great. Well, let's move on to the concept of rules, if you don't mind. And then also, and let's start with committees. You've been, as you mentioned, in appropriations. You were also part of the select committee, the modernization committee. And so you've seen very different kinds of environments in committees or subcommittees, and the rules by which they're governed, which is typically set down by the chairman of the committee, seems to me. So can you talk us through a little bit about the committees you've been in over time and what made certain committees work or certain committees not work? What would be a set of rules that you think would be better and have better outcomes for individual committees?
So, so I saw 2 very different juxtaposed set of rules, basically. The House Modernization Committee that I was vice chair of in my final term was a completely bipartisan committee where we developed our own rules. And so Derek Kilmer was a Democrat and I was a Republican leader. He was a Democrat leader of the committee, and we had 5 other members from each of our parties on the committee. We actually evaluated all the rules of all the other committees. And our task was to find out, well, what's the breakdown in Congress? How can we fix some of this? It's so broken. How do we fix some of it? And so the first thing we did was look at how do we set up our own committee? We were establishing a brand new committee, never had 0 staff, 0 members, and 0 rules. So we were just creating something from scratch. And we both served on the appropriations committee. So we had that unique background. He served in the state legislature as well, as did I. So we had a lot to work with. And what we chose to do was something that had never been done in the case of Congress. And that was to ignore the majority in essence and go, okay, let's have, we're going to have an equally set committee, Republicans and Democrats. Normally, a committee would hire Republican staff and Democrat staff. So you're hiring two different teams to work together, but against one another, right? That's normally the way a normal committee would operate. And we chose not to do that. We said we're going to hire joint staff. And so from the staff director's perspective, Derek said, hey, why don't I interview a few folks? I'll narrow that down and then you interview them and let's pick one together. That's great. Worked out good. We found somebody. And we weren't looking at it from a party background. It didn't, even though that person did come from the Obama administration, it didn't matter because that's not how we were viewing it. Then the next position was the deputy staff director, the assistant staff director there. That was he said, why don't you come up with a couple of folks and you narrow it down and then let me see, and then I will. And so we hired our entire staff jointly. Some of it even came from my congressional office. And we learned that, being equally divided in a committee can work if you're not setting the committee up to compete against itself. And so you've probably seen how committees are. They have these big dioceses and the Republicans are all on one side based on seniority. And the one that's been there the longest is the closest to the gavel and it works its way all the way down. And then the other side's doing the same. We chose to change all of that up. We had random seating, Republicans sitting by Democrats, seniority by another, it just didn't matter. And we actually even changed who ran our meetings at times. We said, well, we got two new members, two incoming members that are freshmen. Why don't we let them co-chair, one committee meeting to give them the opportunity to learn how to their first operation of operating a committee. So to answer your question, things I would change. I really saw how we had success. So committees currently are derived, theoretically, they're derived, the membership is derived, the ratio is driven by the ratio of the House of Representatives. So if it's a 60-40 split in the House, Republicans, Democrats, and 60% of the members of a committee will be Republican, 40% will be Democrat, and vice versa, however it changes. And so it always means the majority has this power. And so the majority then drives, whoever has the power has the rules is what the saying is. We found that it works when you make it tough, when you create a situation in which people have to work together because nothing's going to pass out of that committee, in our case, unless both sides agreed. The Senate now is in that posture, which is really fascinating. It's a 50-50 split in the Senate, Republicans and Democrats. And so all their committees are 50-50. And, it actually creates a work product of some sort. Which is, so they're actually doing it not because they chose to do it, it's just the way the rules are there. But that would be one thing I would encourage a committee to do is tighten up their ratios, get them even if you can, and include the minority. Because one day I was a majority member I was a chairman of a committee and I was a ranking member of a committee, the same committee. And the person who was my ranking member, which would be I know it's Washington lingo, but that's the person in the minority that is the leader of that committee for the other party. I served both roles in the same committee as the leader of a Republican, like really leading it as a chairman and leading it as a ranker with the same person who is my counterpart as well. And we swapped gavels, basically. We had to pass the gavel back and forth, but because we had a working relationship, it was good. It was really good. It worked out well. So I don't know, those are things I just saw how well the Modernization Committee worked, and we had success during the longest government shutdown, during an impeachment, and during a pandemic. Somehow we were able to churn out a really good product.
So what you've described are, seem very sensible operational kinds of, rules, right? How to hire staff, how to sit, those kinds of things. They're employment oriented, they're cultural oriented. What about in terms of the rules bringing up bills? The committee in theory is providing a function of gatekeeping, right? You got a bunch of bills that are submitted and you're only going to let a few out, a few are going to be reported. That process is the power of the committee ultimately, and to mark those up and to offer amendments, et cetera. what about those rules? The rules about which bills to take up, when they should be reported. Should it be at the whim of the chairman? Should it be the majority of the members on the committee? Should it be the majority of members of the House, can, discharge petition it all the way through and enforce it out? If it reaches a certain threshold of co-sponsorship, should it be taken up by the committee? What about those types of like mechanical rules as it relates to legislation? Do you have any insights on those that you thought through over the years?
Yeah, I think that would vary committee by committee, but I think you could do things like that to encourage cooperation. I think co-sponsorships of committee members are important. But there is some value to being able to, I guess, maybe have an agenda or work an agenda or priorities as well. One of the larger challenges with Congress is less about that, and it's more about bandwidth. We found that an average member was on 5.3, I believe, committees or subcommittees. They just couldn't be in every place at all times, and so and it was because of the calendar. Just the general calendar did not allow for it. People were just racing into town and out of town, into town and out of town, and by the time you get your feet on the ground and you get through your jet lag and you get through your committee meetings, oh, I got to go vote. Oh, wait, I got to go back. I have constituents in my office. Now I got to go over here. I have a fundraising event. There just is not the bandwidth or the time. You would really need to change how you do, and the calendar is beginning to reflect it a little bit, but we're still in pandemic mode. You really need committee time. You need to set aside days for committees to work and less time on the House floor. Allow stuff to get out of their committees, allow the committee members to work, and allow them to do that without interruption. I can't tell you how many times you'll be in a committee, be partway through it, and then you have to get up and you have to go to the House floor to vote. And that is one of your duties. You have to vote, but the disruption of that in your work, I mean, you don't do that anywhere else in any other career I know of, where you're in the middle of a meeting, an important meeting, and all of a sudden, oh wait, I got to get up and go down the street, and I'm gonna hang out down there for a few minutes, to do these couple of activities I need to do, and then I'll come back. So postpone it. Really disrupts. So the calendar is a big part of how you might do more. But one thing we did ponder, and I think there's still merit to it, is that when something passes out of a committee unanimously, then maybe it should just move to the floor. And what we were considering was like a consent calendar, that it doesn't have to go through the rules committee and it doesn't need to get changed. There is unanimous agreement in a committee, and therefore let's just move it on to the floor of the House. Almost like it gets privileged to move forward. That too in itself encourages members to work together, get the support, but it also allows for one individual on a committee to say, no, I think it needs to go through the process a little bit more. I agree with your idea, but we need the ability to offer an amendment or something, but that was one thought we had to like streamline legislation that had agreement as well.
And so what about the chairman powers, right? Do you think they should have the essential veto on any legislation that comes through a committee? I mean, this is one, obviously that was a big issue many years ago, right? And one of the reasons that they tried to reform the committee system is because of these all-powerful chairmen. Do you see that as a problem? Is it something where you think it should be more democratic within a committee, or do you think a chairman who controls the agenda is good? And I can see the reason why there too is because it gives them a kind of an ambition to make that committee really work, right? They have an agenda, they want to press it. It could, in theory, make it more productive. I'm curious about your point of view.
Yeah, so appropriations committees is different. It's not an authorizing committee. So I didn't really work within an authorizing committee where the chairman, our bills had to come forward, the appropriation bills, and they were. But I will say, while chairmen are considered all powerful, it's really leadership is all much more powerful, and so leadership can determine whether or not legislation moves in or out of a committee and override the chairman. Now, obviously, chairman has that prerogative, but they typically look towards the agenda of their leadership and what direction they want them want to go in. So how do you trigger something beyond that? That's a really good question. And I guess we did, you know, one recommendation that came out of, it was before us, but I think it was the problem solvers that, you know, if you got so many, you know, signatures on a piece of legislation, it goes to the floor. That's one way to bypass that process. If you have something that a chairman or leadership is standing in the way of, and it has really broad-based support, and I think if you get 290 signatures, I think is the number, then, which means you've been working, and to get 290 signatures out of 435 is a big task. Then it automatically goes to the floor of the House. That rule was changed recently, if I recall.
Yeah. Well, and this, of course, leads to the floor, which is, and you've mentioned all the votes on the floor. What rules or what procedures would you change on the floor to make it better, or are there any? Is it working all right the way it is? I mean, obviously, right now it's controlled by the Rules Committee. It's controlled by the chairman. Or the speaker, I should say. What rules have you seen that are especially bad that you think should change, or good that should be enhanced, or that came out of left field that you think could be interesting?
Well, I feel like the Rules Committee is overused, I should say. I believe in the process, the democratic process, and allowing members to have that free flow of amendments and votes. And so I'm more of a regular order kind of person. And I feel like if you allowed it to, and maybe it can never go back to it, but in the General Assemblies, they work. But what they're scared of and are protective of is that they don't want what are called got you amendments on the floor, that, you know, the minority party's offering this, you have to vote against this, and I'm gonna run a political ad against you. Or if you vote for this, then it's, you know, your leadership's gonna be mad at you, all of that. So they try to protect their own members. So the Rules Committee oftentimes is used, and both parties, I believe, abuse the power of the Rules Committee, because the Rules Committee, it waives all the rules of the House, and so the then a rule goes to the floor that everybody has to vote on, that basically waives all the rules and replaces them with these couple of sheets of paper that have a new set of rules on it that say this is all you can do and this is how you can do it. You know, look, both parties are guilty of using that to protect a piece of legislation, to protect a group of members from having to take a tough vote on something, or making sure only the certain things they want to get voted on are there. I think it would be if you want to build trust in the organization of the House of Representatives, I think you have to trust the members and work through the toughness of it. I think it would be tough in the beginning. There would be a lot of got you amendments. There would be a lot of tough stuff. People would be really mad, but eventually I think it works its way back out into where substance comes forward, you know, at some point.
So you're an open rules guy.
Yeah. You know, and appropriations is that way. That's the, you know, on the House floor, generally an appropriations bill is open, and it takes days oftentimes to work through the hundreds and hundreds of amendments that are permitted.
So, well, then let's go on to the budget and the amendment, the budget and the, you know, appropriations process. So you obviously have an interest in this. You mentioned the balanced budget amendment. Can you just introduce where do you feel that whole process is, from the budget down to the authorizations, appropriations? It's obviously, but most people think it's broken. I had Alan Schick on the program a while back, and he's a budget, the budget expert for many years, and he's sort of given up hope, it looks like, in improving it. But I'm curious about your point of view, where it is, and where do you think what can be changed to make it work?
I think you have to have some tough enforcement mechanisms. Right now, you mentioned authorizing committees and appropriations. So there's one committee that says we authorize this program to be funded. And then there's the appropriations committee that says, okay, we will now apply dollars to that program not to exceed what was authorized. I think there are so most of the federal government right now is not authorized, it's expired. And I was always of the intent in my subcommittee on appropriations that I did not want to fund anything that was not authorized. And so I would send a letter to the authorizing committee saying, here are all the programs that are not authorized. We have no intentions of funding these programs unless you either authorize them or you indicate back to us via letter, a hard communication that you want this to continue. So in essence, it was an authorized light, if you like. We needed the committees. I wanted those committees to acknowledge, one, they haven't fulfilled their duty as an authorizing committee, and is this something they really want to continue on? So I believe one way is that you don't fund things that aren't authorized.
Did they answer your letters?
Yeah, they did, and I said
they gave you authorization light.
Right, they did, and they actually appreciated it. In some cases, they said we are passing this next week, or they really began that communication. But they actually appreciated the fact that there's this tension between an appropriator and an authorizer. And I was one that I didn't want to fund something that wasn't authorized, and I didn't want them to authorize something that I wasn't going to fund. And so we were like really. There was a careful balance there for me on that. And I felt like that made that relationship work really well. So one thing would be is don't fund things that aren't authorized, and maybe you set a clock and say, by this date and time in the future, if these things aren't done, then we're going to begin undoing them. Because clearly there's way too much government now to authorize for Congress to get to it. If it is too much, then maybe we should stop doing some of it and get back to what they should be focused on. And then the other, this is one that my leadership didn't really agree with me on, but there's always this thought about tax cuts, right? We need to cut taxes, and I agree. The tax burden's strong on all Americans, businesses, individuals alike. And I was always of the feeling that, look, if you're going to cut taxes, you have to cut spending. You can't just cut taxes without reducing the spending that it was funding. Otherwise, you're just raising debt. You're increasing your deficit and you're having to use debt. And so I feel like that's another tough mechanism that could be applied. And that is, hey, we're all for cutting taxes, well, let's reduce an appropriate spending along with that. Just like if you're going to increase spending, you have to find the pay for, right? That's what they call it nowadays. And that generally is you're taking it from another program, or you're raising taxes, most likely raising taxes. So I've never known a time that the government has raised taxes and not spent it. So if you're going to reduce taxes, then maybe you should reduce that spending as well.
And so what do you think the way is to do that? I mean, obviously you looked at the balanced budget amendment. I think we talked about that. Or is that the way to do it, through an amendment? Is there some other magical set of processes we could try, or at least explore?
No, it should just be part of the budget process. There's the 1974 Budget Act, that gets updated every now and then. And it should just be a part of that, just saying, or it could be a House rule, or it could be a Republican rule or a Democrat rule. There's that if we're going to do this, then we have to do that. But there's this feeling. I sort of got in a little bit of a verbal disagreement with my leadership back when I was first elected, and because I was not going to support this tax cut. There was a big tax. I think it was extending one of the Bush tax cuts or something. I was like, sorry, I can't do that. Like, were you not for cutting taxes? No, I'm for cutting taxes, but I'm for cutting spending too. And they said, well, you are. This is going to starve the beast. I was like, I don't know that that's the case when you have, I think at the time we had $9 trillion in debt. I mean, it was nothing back then, right? Nothing. And of course, now it's 27 trillion. So that beast is not really starved a whole lot. It continues to consume.
Yeah, cutting seems to be the hardest thing for the government to do. And to find a way or a process by which it can happen seems to be the biggest issue, one of the biggest issues for Congress to deal with.
Yeah.
Maybe we move on then to your earlier mentioning about time, and how, when you think about all the time you spent in Congress, like what do you think an ideal balance of time is for members? Is it, 3 weeks in DC, 1 week at home? Is it all the time in legislation? Is it half with oversight? Is it, how would you break down if you could control all that time?
Well, we proposed a new calendar concept after doing some study of the previous Congresses. And what we determined previously is that members spent more time on airplanes commuting than they did in DC. Can you imagine that? I mean, think about it. It was one day more in travel days than there were full days in Washington, DC. And so we proposed a different concept, and that was to flip that over and to create 2-week blocks where starting Monday morning early, not at a 6 o'clock vote, but normal 9 o'clock day like everybody else goes to work, and go through 5 days and start the next Monday and go through 5 days, putting together, 2 consecutive weeks that bridge a weekend. West Coast wouldn't be able to get home. Most other people wouldn't. That would require generally people to stay, spend more time getting to know one another. Maybe they're going to go out to dinner. Maybe they're going to develop some relationships that way, hang out a little bit, but get in a full 2 work weeks. And then you could take another 2 weeks back in the district. By doing that model, it basically doubled the number of days that people were in DC and cut the travel days in half. It didn't increase the number of days in any way of which anybody was doing anything different. It just reallocated where they were, where their station of work was. And then within that, dedicate certain committee work days and legislative days, voting days, things like that. But it was really about how do you really maximize the time of a member, because it is limited, and focus shouldn't be on politics. It shouldn't be about always being back in the district. Your job is not to campaign. Your job is, you're a lawmaker. That's what you should be, and you should be evaluating that. But you end up on this merry-go-round that gets really tough, and you're just going in and out of airports. And whereas, though, if there was one thing I could change, I had a lot of folks ask me this, if there was one thing you could change about my time, it would have been to have moved to DC. And instead I commuted, and I was in and out every week. I lived in my office, that was a great thing, I guess, as a result of it, though, I was not in my place of work enough. I might have slept in my office at night, but I was racing in and out of airports all the time. And it just wears you out, and then you're disjointed from your family. But had I moved my family, had my kids go to school in the area, and they were going to school with some of my coworkers' kids, and what's the likelihood I'm going to go on cable TV and say something negative about my daughter's friend's dad? It's not going to happen. It doesn't happen in our own local communities. And so that would have probably been one of the big things I would have changed. And so one sort of proposal I didn't put out officially to our committee of modernization was to require members, once you're elected, you have to move to your place of work, sort of just, in jest, but it was like, how would that change things? It would change it a lot.
Yeah, I go back to the pre-Gingrich style, which makes a lot of sense. In terms of the time of the day, so you mentioned earlier about the voting versus committee work. Obviously, sounds like you take a big chunk of the day. Maybe the morning plus for committee, and then squeeze the votes into the end of the day. Is that your philosophy there? Yeah,
or you take knowing that members are on a lot of different committees. If we can do it with colleges and do a block system, and schools can do it, and high school and such, figure out how to develop a way. All it takes is a matrix. Figure out where every member is on whatever committee. How do you rid them of overlap and create a matrix in which on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the A committees are meeting on this day, and the B committees are meeting on this day, and the C committee, whatever. You just figure out a way to do a block system. And then there will be legislative action on the House floor on, Monday, Wednesday, or something like that. You just sort of break them up a little bit. So you're seeing now they have what are called committee work weeks, which is, derives from what we were proposing. And I think we're seeing the committees use that. Now they're still having committee days while they're, they could be on the House floor too, but we're starting to see it move in that direction. And I think it's helping everybody with their continuity of work, which is really important. Efficiency is really important.
So, obviously you've thought a lot about Congress's functioning as an institution in general, and also specific as it related to the Modernization Committee. What other learnings did you have, either that you sort of knew ahead of time and were reinforced, or totally out of the blue ideas from the Modernization Committee, or things that were reinforced? Like, what other kind of the highlights in your mind that you learned through that process that you think might improve Congress's functioning as an institution?
Well, the main takeaway for me out of the Modernization Committee was that it can work. If you can take 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats and tell them the only way they pass anything out of the committee is to have a 2/3 vote, supermajority, and you're going to go through the longest shutdown, and you're going to go through an impeachment, and you're going to go through a pandemic, go get them, guys. I mean, most people say, there's no way that's going to work. And yet we found a way to pass 97 recommendations out that began being implemented early. I mean, from day one, to having the very first time an orientation, freshman orientation was done in a bipartisan way. Previously, every time there was an orientation, it was, okay, Republicans, you go get on the red bus, Democrats, you go get on the blue bus, and you are going to go learn how to defeat each other every day. We're going to teach you how to do your job against one another. Day one this year, it was a bipartisan, freshman orientation, albeit it happened to be a pandemic and they weren't able to be in person like we intended, but it started and now it's there. But one of the maybe the things that alarmed myself and Derek Kilmer was the statistic we learned about how many millions of dollars are spent by each party to defeat the most bipartisan people. And it was alarming to see that. It is something I guess we all knew. It's intuitive. You sort of think about that. You have the frontliners, you have the majority makers, whatever anybody wants to call them. And there are those individuals that serve in a district that one cycle is a Republican there and the next cycle it's a Democrat there. It goes back and forth. The president of their party may win it, it may not win it. They're just marginal districts. And how, because of that, these persons work with people of the other party. They're going to all these other different groups and associations. They're meeting, they're just broader in what they do and how they connect with people. And they're very, very bipartisan. And yet we spend about $40 million a year by both parties to destroy them, defeat them, and replace them. I mean, and Derek and I'll never forget, we just talked about that, how we're hollowing out the process. The very thing we're trying to fix, every 2 years, both of our parties are trying to reinforce. Yeah, so that was a big takeaway. And there's really no way to stop that, but it was something that we learned from there.
Yeah, that's a very interesting behavior by parties, right? When you think about the organizational units and what they're doing and what their organization's interest is versus the members' interest versus the country's interest. And things don't always align.
Right.
So, it's a great segue into my question on representation, which it looks like you've addressed twice, but I'll ask you straight up this time. So, and this is a question I ask all the guests who come on the program. Representative Kilmer's been on here as well. So my question here is, what do you think congressional representation should mean? And what did it mean to you when you were serving?
One way to know if you're doing it, I guess, is go back to your very first mail pieces and your TV ads and spread those mail pieces out on a table and look at them and say, am I doing this? I mean, representation for me was about fulfilling what I said I would do, knowing that my district may trend in a different direction. And this is where it gets tough for folks. I mean, I never wanted to be something other or represent something other than what I had conveyed I would do when I originally ran. And there were times when my district or groups would push me in a direction or encourage me in that direction and say, but you represent us, you're to do this, you're our voice. And I was like, well, I may be that, but that's not who I said I would be. And if I'm not that accurate reflection of what the district is now, then you probably need to find a new representative. And it's hard to hold that. And that's the most important part. But then now something I've seen of late that I think is even more important as a representative is, it's always said that we are the voice of our people. And that is true. We reflect that voice. But once you're elected, you're reflecting all voices. It's Republican, Democrat, Independent, those that don't vote, those that don't care. I mean, you are there to serve a district, not a party, not a group, not a supporter or anything else, the district. But what I found of late, though, is that districts now are reflecting the voices of their elected representatives. They're amplifying it. And I don't know if that's healthy always when we're to be a voice, yes, of our district, but when when our tone is strong and stern and combative, and we're publicly doing that, you'll find your district starts amplifying that. And that's not helpful in the process. So members need to understand that their districts are listening, and they're replicating and they're amplifying the messages that we send back out. And so with that knowledge, choose that well, you choose the right tone, right message, comfort, encourage, because these are scary times. There are a lot of very difficult things our country is facing at any given moment, but in particular the last 2 and 3 years. And this is the time to use that position to provide that support and that comfort and that encouragement back to your district, and not anything else.
So it sounds like your version of representation is you represent everyone in your district, not a slim majority or what have you. It's everyone. And the second is that you make judgments when you're in Congress. It's not necessarily just reflecting the 51% beliefs of the district. You make a judgment and you have your own values that you're working on, and they elected you in part to act out on those values. Is that right?
Yeah, and you'd be surprised. Most of the time you're not making value judgments, you're making fact-based judgments, mathematical, economic, national security decisions. Those are the decisions you're making. And that's where you really have to be able to keep the noise outside a little bit, so that you can focus on the information, the facts that you have. And that's what you've been elected to do, is to make fact-based decisions as best you can. Doesn't mean they're always going to be right. And you clearly can make mistakes and make the wrong decision, but you have to be willing to accept the consequences of either or when it does happen.
What about the future of the district? Now, this is a question I've asked a number of times of different individuals who've come on. And I'm curious, particularly as a politician who really worked, and had to represent groups of people for 2-year stints, right? How did you view the future? The children, the grandchildren, the 5 generations down the line. Is that something that, did you feel like you were representing those future individuals, or did you feel like you were representing the people who are there today, and through them you kind of got at their grandkids and their current interests? How did you view that time element?
I felt like it was really important to engage the youth, and so I started, I think, for 6 consecutive years prior to the pandemic, did what was called a youth leadership summit, where we had 16, 17, and 18-year-olds come from high schools. Their high school would pick who they were. They could pick up to 10 individuals from each one, based on whatever criteria they felt was most important, not on the ones that are, the best grades and all this kind of stuff. I would be very upfront with them and say, no, I want those kids that you see potential in, that they have, you see something unique in them, and they have tough circumstances, but you see that they have that potential. I said, why don't you get them to me? And we would get 500-600 students that would come on this given day and just put on an amazing show. And I would bring in speakers who had grown up in very difficult circumstances, but had accomplished amazing things. And my very first one, I had Joey Jones. And I don't know if you're familiar with Joey Jones. You see him a lot on Fox and stuff nowadays. He was from my district. He triple amputee. He was my first visit to Walter Reed. I'd been in Congress 1 week, had never been, and I went in to visit him. He had just had his legs, patched up or whatever. He's missing both legs and part of a hand. And he was one of my very first speakers. And to have somebody, and so it was persons like him. So getting them in front of youth was so important to encourage, to inspire. And it was built on the theme was dream big, work hard, and achieve much. I wanted their interface, probably the first interface with an elected official, to be one who wasn't seeking their vote, but was seeking to encourage them and inspire them to do something great with their life. And so to your question, yeah, I thought it was so important to look towards the youth.
So my next question is around the debate, deliberation, and dialogue, right, within Congress. These are all slightly different concepts. How do you think that should work out in Congress? There's been discussion about transparency being a driving factor of, too much transparency means people can never compromise. They can't build relationships when the cameras are on. There's some people who think you should go back to the smoke-filled rooms, the bars. If there's no transparency, if there is too much transparency, all the decisions are going to move to places that are opaque, like the leadership office or the party, and that don't have the cameras on. Where do you come out on that? Where do you see, how should these things really happen in Congress?
There needs to be more time and intentional efforts by members to dialogue and discuss differences without audio and video. And there's no question. And having the floor debate and the votes and all of that, and the committee room stuff, that's really good. And that's helpful. It allows people to see their government at work. And I think that's important. But you don't have cameras in the White House. You don't have them in the EPA administrator's building when they're talking about a rule or regulation. You don't have them in the Supreme Court, and there's reasons for that. And that there has to be that opportunity for thoughtful disagreement and discussion to occur. And without that, you only end up with theater, and I'm worried Congress is tacked in that direction of theater, in which individuals can make amazing speeches, just tear it up, and then soon after will be a fundraiser, email or blast go out, or something, and that's not. It should be what it's intended for, but there needs to be that time and space for coworkers to have discussion. Without everyone looking in all the time. And that's the case in every other work environment.
Do you think they should close up the committee meetings, or some of those should still remain open?
No, I think it's fine for the committees to be open, and I think that works, but there are a lot of committees that aren't open. Ethics committee is not open. The Intel committee most of the time is not open. There's room for people to work. Nothing's being hidden. Everything is voted on publicly, but sometimes there should be that confidentiality of a discussion that occurs. I think about just this week, how many times do you hear so-and-so and so-and-so is going to the White House to speak with the president about reconciliation or about whatever's going on? You hear about that, and they generally come out and they don't run to the cameras and go, this is what I told the president, and this is what he told me, and They're not doing that because there's a dialogue occurring, and they're trying to reach a resolution on something in which there's disagreement, and you don't get there when you publicize it all.
But in terms of the debate aspect of it, where it is public, whether it's in committee or on the floor, do you have any suggestions on how that could be structured so that it would be less of the posturing and more of the substance for people to consume?
It may be hard to change some of that, but those are always public anyhow. You can, aside from TV, you can, sit in the gallery and or sit in a committee room. So that I think that's always important to have. But the structure of it, I think people I think it all changes when people spend a little more time getting to know one another. And I'm so different in all this, I know, than other members, but I was so intentional back. I was in my second or third year. And I reached out to Joe Kennedy and Henry Cuellar. So Henry Cuellar is a blue dog Democrat from South Texas on the border, Laredo, Hispanic. And Joe Kennedy, liberal Massachusetts Democrat with lineage and, and the whole Kennedy family. I reached out to them and said, hey, why don't once a month, let's go get dinner, just us, and let's alternate who pays. We became such good friends as a result of that, and then changed it to a breakfast, and we just stuck with it. And you find there's so much in common. You may disagree on 10, 20% of issues and how do you get there, but life is the same, family is the same, your disagreement with your leadership's the same, all of that. And that was so valuable and important to me. And plus it humanized folks who are often vilified, right? It humanized, and all of us brought us all together to the point that Henry Cuellar hosted a fundraiser for me in his district. I mean, that doesn't happen. As a result of that, I hosted a fundraiser for Kirsten Sinema not long after that, who was in the House, a Democrat in the House. It was one of my running parties, so that to me is where the value is. And you know what? There wasn't a camera there. It wasn't televised. And we had really deep, valuable conversations as a result of it, and friendships were developed.
Next question is, what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within 50 years?
I don't know that in the next 50 years, not much changes in Congress. I don't know if y'all just really noticed that. It's very, very similar, which is nice, but it needs to modernize. It needs to, it's not so much about rules and all those kind of things. The one thing that could really, really help is if there was professional development for members of Congress. And this is going to sound strange, but you get elected, you probably were, in my case, I was a real estate investor, had never been a public speaker, never managed an organization. And now all of a sudden I'm in charge of 21 people, a multi-million-dollar budget, and I'm expected to know everything from national security to environmental issues to climate change to whatever. I never got one class on anything. I never learned the latest PowerPoint, Excel, Microsoft Word, Instagram, nothing. I mean, zero. No speech preparation, no writing classes. Every other occupation and career path seems to allow for professional development of an individual. I think members of Congress could use that in a lot of ways, and particularly just how to run an organization, right? How to hire people. If you've how to put together an employee manual, any of that stuff. That's the things that you're learning on the fly, and who gets brought in with you as a campaign manager who becomes your chief of staff, who's never done any of that either. And they're probably like 22, 23, 24 years old, So that would be one change I think could be really valuable to individual members, because one day, just as I am not in office anymore, it would help to leave with some skills, something other than being able to vote or being able to, give a speech or something. And it'd be good to be skilled when you go back to the workforce.
Well, that's a great segue to my next question and final question, which is, what are your plans? What's next for yourself? And is it DC? Is it back in Georgia? What's your plan next?
Yeah, so I left just over a year ago, and I acquired an existing governmental affairs shop, been around for 32 years. And we have since basically tripled the number of folks working in our office, the folks we represent. And And so I'm in DC and Georgia, and I tell you, I love it because I'm still involved in policy, and I'm still involved with people and the relationships, and I'm still involved with the politics of it all. But now I get to assist companies in helping navigate the complexities of the process, all the things you've talked about, in addition to the rules and the regulations, and help with that interface. So it's just a different type of constituent services in a way. But I'm really enjoying it because I'm still involved in what I was doing. It's just in a different capacity. So I'm the president and CEO of Urban Graves Strategy Group. Is the answer.
Great. Well, Representative Graves, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for your service. It's been a pleasure, and best of luck with your next steps.
Thanks so much. It's great to talk with you, and appreciate what you're doing with the Institute and your efforts to improve how Congress operates. That's so needed. So needed.
Thank you.